Good evening, and welcome to tonight's program. It Matters, United States versus Wong Kim Ark. I'm Michael Trong, the Executive Director of the Chinese American Museum. Before we begin, I'd like to start off by stating that the Chinese American Museum acknowledges that this virtual event is taking place across the continent of North America, also known as Turtle Island, original and unceded territories of hundreds of sovereign indigenous peoples and nations. We acknowledge and honor the original caretakers of the various places our speakers are joining us from. Today, I'm joining you from downtown Los Angeles in the facilities of the Chinese American Museum, physically located on the historic village site of the Yamna and the Tavagna unceded traditional territories of the Gabrielino, Shoshone, Kint, and Tongva indigenous peoples of these lands. To this day, there are at least 7 tribes of the Gabrielino people who maintain an ongoing presence, power, and relations amongst their people, their natural relations, and the land that they belong to. I invite you to remember the indigenous people who affirm their sovereignty and their ongoing relations with the land you occupy, and ask yourself, how do you, your people, or your organization honor these relatives? I would now like to take a moment to thank our FCAM board members and staff, and a special thank you to our community partners for supporting this event. Here's some things that you might need to know before we begin. The program is being recorded and will be made public for viewing on our YouTube channel in the future. Your video and microphone has been disabled, but if you have any questions for our guest speakers, please send a chat to the host Chinese American Museum, and we'll try to address them towards the end of the program. Tonight's program honors the 125th anniversary of the United States versus Wong Kim Ark decision. This monumental moment in history is often a known piece of the Chinese American experience, but tonight we have the honor to learn more about Wong Kim Ark's contribution to civil rights and what it meant not just for Chinese Americans, but for all people of color for the past 125 years. It is history like this that our museum strives to make known so that the legacy of our community continue to be recognized and celebrated. I let the speaker tonight go into more details about the significance of the landmark case. We're here and excited to present Frank H. Wu, who's joining us tonight. He served as the 11th president of Queens College. Prior to joining the City University of New York system, Frank served as chancellor and dean, and then William L. Prosser Distinguished Professor at the UC College of Law, San Francisco. Prior to that, he was a member of the faculty at Howard University for a decade. During the Obama administration, he was appointed by the Federal Department of Education for its National Advisory Committee on Institutional Quality and Integrity, which advises the administration on higher education accreditation. He is also the author of Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White, and co-author of Race, Rights, and Reparation, Law and the Japanese American Internment. Frank is also a long-term friend of the Chinese American Museum, and in 2012 gave a keynote speech during our commemoration of the Chinese Massacre of 1871. We're so glad to have you back with us tonight. Next, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today. Dr. Trinh Vo is a professor and former chair of the Department of Asian American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. She's the author of Mobilizing an Asian American Community, co-author of Vietnamese in Orange County, and Transforming Orange County, Assets and Needs of Asian Americans and Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islander. Dr. Vo was the president of the Association of Asian American Studies and has served in leadership and advisory roles with several community organizations, including VIT Stories, Vietnamese American Oral History Project, Asian American Advancing Justice, Orange County Asian and Pacific Islander Community Alliance, VIT Film Fest, and VIT Rise. Linda, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I'll go ahead and pass it over to two of you to open their program.
I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you so much, Michael, and the Chinese American Museum for having me and all of the co-sponsors. And I really look forward to Frank's talk about an historic landmark Supreme Court case.
Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here with you. I'm going to show a few PowerPoint slides. As my wife says, no one wants to look at your big head for an hour. So I'll have some visual aids to guide us through this. And we've left ample time for Q&A. If you look in the chat, you'll see how you can send. Oh, I'm looking at the chat. It doesn't have the information. Maybe someone will put it up, but there's a system that we're using. Yes, where you send a private chat to the host, and then our wonderful moderator will help guide the Q&A. So what I'd like to do is talk to you first about the context of the Wong Kim Ark case. What happened before this incredibly important Supreme Court decision, which recognized birthright citizenship, regardless of race or ethnicity. Then I'd like to talk to you about the actual legal doctrines and the legal arguments and the case itself. And then finally, I'll turn to what does it mean for us today, because this isn't just historical. These issues remain alive and well, and as controversial now as they were then. So I'll go ahead and start the screen share. Give me one moment. There we go. Let me turn this into the slideshow. Okay. So this is a photo of Wong Kim Ark himself. He was born in San Francisco. He worked as a chef at Chinese restaurants, and his parents had come from China across the Pacific and settled in San Francisco. The most important fact for our purposes, I will say again, he was born in San Francisco on United States soil. Okay, before we start talking about Wong Kim Ark, though, let's back up a little bit and just talk about Chinese Americans. That term would not have been in use then, and indeed you could in some ways think of Wong Kim Ark as the very first Chinese American. And the term Asian American also wasn't in use. In the Q&A, we can touch upon a little bit of how Asian American came to be a term that was pan-Asian and also asserted the American identity of those who came to use it in the 1960s. So back then, there were already Chinese immigrants. And I want to set the context. It's so little known. It's so obscure, even to Chinese Americans themselves. I'm going to show you this book. So I came across this book, which was published by the National Park Service just a few years back. And I'll tell you, I was surprised by this. And I'm someone who, this is what I do. I'm a scholar who looks into this time period, into Asian Americans. And I'll be honest, I did not know that there were this many Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who fought during the US Civil War. Remember, that's 1861 to 1865. And this is not fake news. This is not a deep fake photo. This is a real photo of a soldier. Now, he happens to have been adopted by a white family. But what the researchers who put together this book did, they went through all the archives. They looked at the rosters of the Union and Confederate armies, and they found not one, not two, not dozens. They found hundreds of Asian immigrant soldiers on both sides of that battle. So this is really just astonishing, just groundbreaking research. And the takeaway here is that Asian immigrants have been in the United States for a very long time. There are even Asian Americans who can trace their lineage back to the Mayflower. Now, when I say that, people scoff. They say, no, that's absurd. That can't be true. But it is thanks to intermarriage. So on the Anglo side of the family, people such as Senator Tammy Duckworth go all the way back to the colonial era because they're Anglo-Asian. But I show you this because it's important to establish that the Asian immigrant population, although sparse and not distributed uniformly, right? It was concentrated then, as it is now, existed all the way back at the time of the US Civil War. All right. Now, the most well-known episode of Asian American history is this. This is a painting. It's part of a wonderful series, just a terrific series that was rediscovered and is at the Chinese Historical Society of America in San Francisco. This is a painting by a fellow named Jake Lee. This is the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Now, if you know anything about Asian Americans, there's one sentence in the history textbook that says that Chinese laborers, men, built the western half of the Transcontinental Railroad. So this would be right after the Civil War. And this was a massive project. It was the most massive infrastructure project in the United States to date. It was speculative. People thought this would never be built. And it united the nation, which had just come out of the Civil War. And there's another way you can tell. Historians have looked at this. You can tell from the grammar. If you go back to that time period when people talked about the United States, let's say you wanted to say something about the beauty of the United States, you would say the United States are a beautiful nation. Now that sounds odd to the modern ear because it's pluralized, showing that the states were thought of as much more sovereign, but now we would say the United States is a beautiful nation. The point is, the United States was not united at the time the Transcontinental Railroad was built. If you wanted to travel from Boston to San Francisco, you would have had a perilous overland journey, or you would have had to sail for weeks in order to make that trip. And the Transcontinental Railroad changed all that. It was the realization of what had been called manifest destiny, which is rightly contested. That was the notion that white European Christian settlers would exercise dominion over the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and not incidentally, displace and seize lands that belonged to native peoples or that were cared for by native peoples, of which they were the stewards. So the Transcontinental Railroad was built two halves. There was a half from the east headed west and half from the west headed east. And they met at Promontory Point, Utah in 1869. This particular photo shows blasting through sheer granite rock face by Chinese laborers. The Chinese, the work crews were segregated then, and it was 10 to 15,000 Chinese laborers who worked on the Transcontinental Railroad on the western half. They constituted probably 90+% of the workforce. This particular painting shows you the origin of the phrase, a pejorative phrase, but one you may remember. It's gone out of use now, a Chinaman's chance, referring to very low odds of success. Why? Because the fellows in the wicker baskets, they have sticks of dynamite. They're going to blow their way through the mountain. However, dynamite is volatile, it was a new technology, and there was a risk that they themselves would be blown to bits if they couldn't be hauled up, back up that sheer rock face by their compatriots who are at the top, who you can see. All right, so the Chinese were very much present and yet absent. The iconic photos taken back then would have been known. They were published in every newspaper. They would have been known to anyone who knew what was happening in the world. If you look at those photos, even though the Chinese laborers built the western half, they weren't invited to the Golden Spike ceremony. There isn't any photo that shows an Asian face. Maybe you can glimpse one of them in the background, but the people celebrating are all white. So that's a symbolic exclusion. It was later in an act of what he called photographic justice made up for by Corky Lee, a famed photographer passed away during the COVID-19 pandemic. He brought the descendants, by then 6th and 7th generation Americans, that's very much part of the Wong Kim Ark story, how they became Americans, out to Promontory Point to restage the photos with the descendants of the laborers properly depicted front and center. So then after the US had gone through some boom and bust periods, and this museum very much is aware of and commemorates as the city of Los Angeles is finally coming around to acknowledging the 1871 massacre. In a single 24-hour time period, 1 out of 10% of the residents of Los Angeles, then a frontier town, was killed. So this was mass violence. It was mass murder. Nobody was ever brought to justice for it, but it was motivated by a sense of racialized economic competition. And it was not in isolation. The Rock Springs, Wyoming massacre, in town after town after town, including frontier settlements, the Chinese were driven out, the words of one leading study of this, where they were shot, they were stabbed, they were lynched, and we're talking about even women and children being driven out. There was arson, the settlements were burned to the ground, and they were forced to give up mining claims and just to leave. So this is the context in which all this happens. And then in 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed. Now, there are a whole series of laws that get passed by Congress, and these are bipartisan. Hardly anyone opposes them. The two parties competed to be more anti-Chinese, and the rallying cry was the Chinese must go. And what this meant is that people such as Wong Kim Ark's parents or his cousins, what this meant is that they either couldn't come legally anyway. There was a whole tradition of paper sons, a subject for a different talk. And then if they were already here, so if they were here, subject to stringent rules, they could stay, but they could not naturalize. Right? This is very important as part of the background of Wong Kim Ark. So Wong Kim Ark's parents could have been summarily deported. His cousins could have been excluded. And even if his parents stayed, didn't matter whether they learned English, whether they converted to Christianity, how similar they were, they could not naturalize. Asians were not allowed to. There was a racial bar. There was a color line. Most people don't know this. It was affirmed by the US Supreme Court even as late as 1922 and 1923 in a pair of cases, one involving someone of Japanese descent, one involving someone of South Asian descent. Now, there are some exceptions. The original Siamese twins, co-joined twins, the Bunker twins, they did naturalize. So in a few local instances, the courts disregarded the official rule, which was in order to naturalize, you had to be a free white person or of African nativity or descent. So Wong Kim Ark's parents, even if they could stay, could not become US citizens through the naturalization process. This is important to have in the back of your head when we get to his case. All right, so this is just another one of the media drawings of the Chinese being driven out. So this was known. This was not covered up in the sense that people were aware that this happened, but it was just accepted. Now, there are a few aspects of this that I want to mention. One is sometimes people say, well, isn't this just citizens versus aliens? No, because many of the attackers were themselves foreign born. Many of the agitators, Dennis Kearney, one of the leading campaigners for Chinese exclusion, was himself from County Cork, Ireland. So this was not citizens versus aliens. This was in many instances white newcomers against Asian newcomers. And the arguments they made have if you go back and read some of the documents, such as this headline, "The Chinese Must Go," this pamphlet, "Meat versus Rice" by Samuel Gompers. This is a little after Wong Kim Ark, but it captures the relevant sentiment. This is, of course, pre-internet, pre-TV, pre-radio. This is when, if you want to make a point, you printed up a pamphlet. This is printed by the Asiatic Exclusion League, which is entirely mainstream. These are not fringe organizations. We might think of them that way today, but reputable people, leading politicians, the citizens who were well thought of belong to groups such as this. So Gompers, who's considered a progressive labor leader, that's the other aspect of this. This is not, you shouldn't think of this as liberal or conservative. People of all political backgrounds, of all parties, made the same sorts of arguments. But if you go and look at a pamphlet such as "Meat versus Rice," Gompers makes arguments that just are uncanny in how similar they are to some of the claims made today. What does he say? Well, meat versus rice is a metaphor, but he also means it literally. His argument is Asians subsist on rice. White people need to eat meat. That's unfair. because rice is more readily available and cheaper. But that's also symbolic of the notion that the Asians work too hard. This is sort of the prototype of a model minority, right? So understand the argument against the Chinese was not they're inferior, they're not hardworking. No, it was they're superior. They will work harder than their white rival, and therefore they must be kept out. Right. So that was all successful. So there are all these laws that either prohibit Chinese, and this was later extended to the Asiatic Exclusion League in 1917, that prohibit Chinese and later Asians from coming, or prohibit them from naturalizing, even if they're already here. Okay. That's all the background. Let's turn to Wong Kim Ark. This is about birthright citizenship. So citizenship has existed as a concept ever since there have been nation states. And basically, there are two ways that people, it's generally thought of, become citizens. One is birth on soil, on a particular land, and you then are recognized as a citizen of that place. The other is lineage, blood. You inherit it. So it comes to you from your parents, from your grandparents, and you inherit the same status that they had. So those are the two basic routes. Now, this particular study, a leading study, is about the historic struggle for Black equality. So the Civil War is fought, and then the 14th, 15th, and 16th, I'm sorry, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed, and the Constitution has to be changed to eradicate chattel slavery, because if you go back, this is, it's all in the document itself. You can look it up for yourself. The Constitution recognizes the institution of slavery, right? And so to undo that, you have to amend the Constitution, which is an arduous process. And the 14th Amendment is passed. This is the most famous, the key part of this. There are two different parts, all right? We typically think of the second sentence. So I'm going to start there, but it's the first sentence that matters in the Wong Kim Ark case. So let's just read this out loud. Right, so this is the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. All right, that last phrase, the equal protection of the laws, this is where equality is introduced into American jurisprudence. Now let's turn to the first sentence. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Now, what is this doing? In part, this is trying to undo the Dred Scott decision that the Supreme Court had rendered before the Civil War, which basically made Black persons who were enslaved non-citizens. All right, so this ensures that they're both citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So it's two different levels. Okay. But it's written without reference to race. This does not say persons who were enslaved, does not say people who are Black, does not say African nativity or descent, doesn't say anything like that. It's universal, it's abstract. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state where they reside. Okay, so Wong Kim Ark, born in San Francisco, leads his life, didn't set out to be a civil rights icon. He visits China, okay, and then he wants to come back to the U.S. and he's stopped and he's told, you cannot come into the U.S. Why not? Well, because of the Exclusion Act, you're not allowed in. He says, wait, 14th Amendment, I was born in the United States, and based on this text, and there's some schools of thought that some of the justices subscribe to, which say you should just read the text in the most literal manner. You should give the plain meaning. So we just read that first sentence, and it says all persons born and naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. So that particular clause adds a little ambiguity, because one of the things the government said is, yeah, but you, Wong Kim Ark, you're a subject of the Chinese Empire, so you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Therefore, this doesn't apply to you. But if you just think for a moment, if Wong Kim Ark had gone and jaywalked or committed a more serious crime, you can bet that the courts of the United States would say you're subject to our jurisdiction. They would not say you're a diplomat or something like that. Although part of what they think about when they're interpreting this, when his case goes up to the Supreme Court, is children of diplomats and others like that. But this is Wong Kim Ark. This is the basis of his. He says it's because of this that I get to come in, because I am a native-born citizen, and therefore you cannot exclude me. So this goes before the U.S. Supreme Court. And I want to read to you just a little bit of what the, hold on, let me pull this up, of what the Solicitor General argued. So the Solicitor General is the lawyer for the United States in front of the U.S. Supreme Court. So he represents the government, the people. And before you go and do your oral argument, where you stand in front of the justices and speak, you file legal briefs. And in his legal briefs, he made a number of arguments. The main argument he made uses, there's a Latin term, a fortiori. You don't have to know Latin. It's just saying all the more so. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose that I'm driving a car, okay, and I'm going 75 miles per hour, all right, and I get a ticket because I'm going 75 miles per hour, and that exceeds the speed limit. If I get a ticket at 75 miles per hour, someone driving 95 miles per hour, a fortiori should get a ticket because they're driving faster than me. If I've exceeded the speed limit, they've exceeded it by even more. So just think of the phrase, all the more so. Okay, so what the government said is, we could exclude your parents and we can prohibit them from naturalizing. Now, Wong Kim Ark's lawyers did something very interesting. They did not contest that. They conceded. They said, US government could exclude Chinese people, and it could prevent them from naturalizing. They didn't challenge that. Why didn't they challenge that? Well, they looked at the Supreme Court and they realized, well, the Supreme Court had just recently said these things. Yes, you can exclude people and so on, and the lower courts had prohibited Asians from naturalizing. So there's no point making an argument that would be a losing argument, and they didn't have to make that argument. All right, but what the government said is Wong Kim Ark can't be in any better position than his parents. If his parents cannot be citizens, a fortiori, Wong Kim Ark can't be a citizen either, right? Because the idea is the child can't have a status greater than the parents. This, by the way, shows that in this jurisprudence, no one's thinking about individuals, right? This is an inherited status. It's you're stamped with it. It's in your blood. But then the Solicitor General has a rhetorical flourish. And I'm just going to read from the brief. And this is, you can find this online should you wish to check it. And I think it's important to do that. You know, we live in an era where some people don't care about evidence or facts. And I think it's important that when people make claims that should be supported by evidence, that they can point to the facts. So you can actually find the legal briefs, and if you're interested, just look at the legal briefs in the Wong Kim Ark case, the ones filed by the Solicitor General of the United States. He sums up why he thinks Wong Kim Ark should not be recognized as a birthright citizen. He says, there certainly should be some honor and dignity in American citizenship that would be sacred from the foul and corrupting taint of a debasing alienage. Are Chinese children born in this country to share with the descendants of the patriots of the American Revolution the exalted qualification of being eligible to the presidency of the nation, conferred by the Constitution in recognition of the importance and dignity of citizenship by birth? That's a rhetorical question. He says, then he answers the question, If so, then verily there has been a most degenerate departure from the patriotic ideals of our forefathers, and surely in that case, American citizenship is not worth having. So he's saying if Chinese people get to be citizens, well, surely in that case, American citizenship is not worth having. He presumably didn't think that there would be a Chinese who's also a descendant of a patriot of the American Revolution. That is thanks to mixed marriage that didn't occur. And this was in an era of anti-miscegenation. So it makes sense that that's not something that he thought of. All right, so Wong Kim Ark prevails. He actually wins. This is and it's so important to lift up this case for many reasons, and not the least of which it sets precedent. Any one of us, so this is me, this is probably many of you on the Zoom, who is a birthright citizen of the United States, we owe Wong Kim Ark. This is how we came to be birthright citizens. Someone had to fight all the way up to the US Supreme Court. But that's the other aspect. The Chinese were not passive. They hired the best lawyers, i.e. white lawyers. There weren't Chinese lawyers back then. There were Chinese who went to law school, but they weren't allowed to become lawyers. They weren't allowed to sit for the bar exam. Even if they could pass it, they couldn't become members of the bar, that is lawyers. So, and they fought. So they were not passive. They were not submissive. They organized. The different families funded this. And it's not just that they fought, they won a handful of cases. Wong Kim Ark is one of them. There's another one called Yik Wo versus Hopkins. There are a handful of cases that the Chinese immigrants win in the US Supreme Court remarkably through this great lawyering. And what's the argument? The argument is, just read 14th Amendment. It says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. So it says it right there. And one of the aspects of this that people don't realize, sometimes people say, oh, wait a minute, come on. We all know that all these amendments were passed. And when Congress was thinking about this, they were thinking in particular about people who had been enslaved. It is true. They were thinking primarily of people who were enslaved. But if you go back and look through the historical record, if you look at the congressional record, there were people who opposed all this. And what they said was, hey, you should be aware it's not just this will help Black people, this is going to help those Chinese people too. Therefore, I oppose it, right? So while it wasn't at the front of their minds, they were aware. And the Chinese issue was talked about nationally, even though it was concentrated in California and on the West Coast. The subject of Chinese exclusion was debated in newspapers and taken up by politicians from coast to coast. So Wong Kim Ark wins this case. All right, let's now turn to why it matters to today. History is not dead. It's not even the past. In the 1980s, two scholars write this book, Peter Schuck and Roger Smith. This book is called Citizenship Without Consent, Illegal Aliens in the American Polity. This book is such an important book. It's an academic book. None of you is likely to run out and buy it. I would not recommend supporting this cause. However, check it out in the library. This book is one of the most important books that gives intellectual credibility to the demonization of people who are undocumented. Yeah, I should pause and digress for a moment. There's a wonderful historian, May Nye. She has written about and documented, and others have done this too, but her work is just such influential work. She has shown how until relatively recently, let's call it the past 40 years, past two generations, the concept of illegal alien or undocumented, to make it less pejorative, was not thought of as a status. It wasn't thought of as criminal, in part because there was so much ambiguity, right? And there were so many people who, if you actually went and looked at, did they have all the papers they needed to have at the time they entered, or did they overstay their visa? Many people have in their ancestry somebody who was illegal or in some way not entitled to be in the United States. However, in the 1980s, this term illegal alien takes on a much sharper edge to it. And this book is one of the reasons. So this book gets written to challenge Wong Kim Ark. And these two scholars say, no, the justices had it all wrong because the people who weren't of Chinese descent who were here would never have consented, and people who are citizens are not consenting to people who are undocumented being part of the body politic. That's the polity. I don't want to characterize this book as racist because I think it's important to actually grapple with these ideas. It's, I would say, circular because this is part of who is defining who is us and who is them. But what they do is they assume that one group is privileged and able to confer the consent, right? It's sort of in their title. Why isn't it the other way around? Why isn't it that the Chinese have to consent to the Irish? You know, the way they frame it is there is a group that deems itself to be the arbiters, the decision makers, the authorities, and they've decided that this other group isn't entitled to be here, and therefore the first group is the one that has to give the consent, the second group is the one that has to receive the consent. So I would say part of the problem here is it's circular, but the bigger problem with this book as a work of scholarship is it's just wrong as to the historical record. The 14th Amendment, if you want to look at the intent of those who passed it, who supported it, was to confer citizenship in this universal way. That was their goal. It was to eliminate the prior racial discrimination. Okay, we're almost done with the talk. We'll turn to Q&A. Then Proposition 187 is proposed by the voters of California. So you might know of this. It was in 1994. It was a ballot measure. It passed. It was endorsed by many, Governor Pete Wilson. This is one of the signs showing the border crossing, and the campaign for Proposition 187, which denied social services, government services to anyone who was undocumented, was premised on this notion, as the organizers of it called it when they tried to get on the ballot, was the Save Our State measure, right? Before it was given a number, Prop 187, Save Our State. There again, just as with the book that I showed you, there is a circularity of the reasoning. Who is the us? Save our state. So those proponents of it believe that they belong to a group that has possession of the state, possession of the land. So that then leads to later measures in Congress that restrict migration greatly. In 1995 and 1996, additional measures passed. And it's so important to see this in context because the Wong Kim Ark case does something that very few cases that I know of do, which is it brings together all these different communities of color, the African Americans who had been enslaved, the Asian immigrants seeking birthright citizenship, and the modern discourse about anchor babies and migration from the South across the southern border of the US. It is a racialized dynamic where the perception is that the people who are illegal are of Latino ethnic backgrounds specifically. So that's the Wong Kim Ark case. I've given you some sense of the context of the case, the case itself, the arguments, and its contemporary significance. And I look forward to your questions. I will turn you over to our wonderful moderator, Linda.
Thank you very, very much, Frank, for giving us this overview and giving us a context for understanding the conditions in which Chinese immigrants and other Asian immigrants lived during the 1800s and early 1900s, and the racial animosity they faced, legal, economic, and cultural. And also, most importantly, the forms of resistance that they engaged in, how Wong Kim Ark fought against the discrimination he faced as a US-born citizen, and leading to this precedent case in 1898. Before I open up to discussion, I just want to ask you some questions to further the conversation on this particular case. And I'm most interested, I understand that Wong Kim Ark's immigrant parents who could not become US citizens returned to China, but Wong Kim Ark stayed in this country. He actually had a wife who lived in China, and he birthed 4 sons. And he was able to get them to come to immigrate to the US, and some of them were granted US citizenship, with one serving in the US military. So I'm just wondering, how birthright citizenship enabled US-born Chinese and other Asian Americans to establish their roots in the US, particularly as their first-generation immigrant parents were denied the rights of citizenship and naturalization.
Right. One of the fascinating aspects, if you look in particular at Chinese migration in the US, if you talk to people, even today, about what generation they are, sometimes the answer is complicated. It's not that they're 3rd generation or 4th generation. It depends on whether you count the migration back and forth, because there are people whose grandparents or great grandparents were born in the US, yet the next generation wasn't. Right now, why is that? Well, because of the exclusion acts, right? So some people were able to come, but then got excluded, got deported, or had families that were in China. And so you can have in one family all sorts of statuses, right? You can have people who are native born and people who are foreign born, but usually, so in my family, my parents came to the US, all right? And you typically, and I was born in the US, so you typically have foreign born parents, US born children, but because of exclusion, it's sometimes the other way around. You have US born parents, but foreign born children, and a lot of back and forth. That, by the way, many people said, and even as recently as one of the earliest academic studies of people of Chinese descent in the US is called Bitter Strength. It's written by a fellow named Gunther Barth, came out in, I think, 1964. It's a famous book. It's a good book in the sense that it's one of the earliest studies, and he was interested in people of Chinese descent when no one else was. It's a very bad book in its framing because it embraces the sojourner hypothesis. Some people said, well, the Chinese and the later Asians weren't like whites coming to the US. What they said is they were sojourners, travelers, that they didn't intend to stay. They were just coming here for a little while. They didn't have a commitment to democratic ideals, and then they were going to leave. That's wrong for lots of reasons. It's wrong both because it's just factually not correct. It's a stereotype. It's a generalization. Is it true of some? Yes. Is it true of all? No. But also reverses cause and effect. It's not that the way Gunther Barth framed it is the reason Chinese face discrimination is because they didn't intend to stay. I would suggest, no, it's the other way around. The reason they didn't stay is because they faced discrimination. They faced violence and they were forcibly ejected. But the last aspect of this is actually true for migrants from many, many parts of the world to the US, especially in that time period, but even now. We tend to have an ahistorical view where we think, oh, it's our era that's global and people move back and forth. Not so. Even back then, very few people study this, but a handful have looked at it. There were many European migrants who came, lived in the US for 40 years, then went back to the old country and retired there. So were some Chinese sojourners? Yes, but many, many people who came to the US were either voluntarily or involuntarily people who then later went back to their land of birth. So the story of Wong Kim Ark and his parents going back and forth like that, and then his children and having a wife in China is not actually unusual.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Thank you for expanding on this. Having said that, there have been cases in which politicians or other political leaders have tried to rescind or undermine this particular case in birthright citizenship. And I can definitely think about in the last presidential administration, President Trump was very vocal about his stance to end birthright citizenship, which actually for many people was the first time they knew about it in the American public, and it became part of our public discourse. But there were previous instances where others have tried to do the same. What do you think, of the attempts, there'll be more attempts in the future to try to undermine or change it? Because many argue that if we got rid of birthright citizenship, we would get rid of our immigration problems, et cetera. So how do you respond to those who say that if we got rid of the birthright citizenship, we wouldn't have these immigration problems that we have today?
Right, right. Well, so you are absolutely correct. There is a movement now. And I don't mean on the fringe with just avowed white supremacists. There's actually a movement, and it dates back to that book from the 1980s by Shuckman Smith, through some type of constitutional amendment or by putting another case up in front of the Supreme Court to eliminate birthright citizenship. And I think you're also right. Most people who are birthright citizens don't really think about how they're birthright citizens. They just take it for granted. And until very recently, I think other than for legal scholars, Wong Kim Ark was not very well known. And even when I went to law school in the late 1980s, the Wong Kim Ark case was not commonly taught. You would have to go and find it and read it. But yes, this is continued to come up. It came up in the Hamdi case and in some other Supreme Court cases where people have made a direct frontal attack and said, this person is not a citizen of the US. I would say, as sometimes is true with issues of race, people get it exactly backwards. So one of the issues or another term, a pejorative term, sometimes meant as a pejorative term, that's associated with birthright citizenship is anchor baby.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think people have it exactly wrong. Anchor babies are great, right? I'm an anchor baby in some sense. My parents came to the US as scholarship students. Were they sure they were going to stay? No, they weren't sure they were going to stay. But then they had my brothers and me, and we're Americans through and through. In a way that I think even those who would insist on assimilation would regard as positive, right? And so my parents are here. My mom passed away in 2014. I said to my dad, do you want to take her ashes back to Taiwan or back to mainland China? He said, no, the family is here now. And that's a very clear sign. My mother is buried in suburban Washington, D.C. My father will be buried there at some point. He calls it a condominium. It's a whole 2 urns. And that's a break from tradition, right? And it's a deliberate break because my father recognizes that the family has staked a claim and that the family is located now on this side of the Pacific. I think that's not unusual. That story, my family's not idiosyncratic that way. We may be a little weird in other ways, but not in that way, right? Children are born in the US, and the parents, even if they might have been reluctant when they first came here, the parents realize, hey, my kids are American now. My grandchildren, they're American. Therefore, even if I didn't quite think when I came as a youngster that I was going to be an American, the family became American.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just expanding on that, in your case, is I think representative of a lot of families, immigrants who come here, and they're not sure they're going to settle here or live here permanently, but once they have children and their children establish roots, it's hard to uproot those children, right? As well. But oftentimes the argument against birthright citizenship is related to the undocumented, which you mentioned, and also those who might come on a tourist visa or a temporary visa sometimes. So the arguments, anti-immigrant arguments related to the Wong Kim Ark case and birthright citizenship. So can you expand a little bit about what counter arguments you would provide to those who say that, for those reasons, particularly, we should get rid of it?
Well, all the studies that look at this show that migration in the aggregate over the long run is economically good for the US. So even if you didn't care about civil rights at all, even if you didn't care about diversity, if all you cared about is self-interest, the United States has been built on brain drain, migration, whether voluntary or involuntary, whether it's people who are fleeing, including forced migration, which is not good, right? That forced migration is a bad thing. But the United States is a beneficiary of all of this. And it is a unique experiment. I believe in the American dream. I believe the notion that self-governance, that democracy beckons the world over, and that people yearn for the freedoms here. And that is what gives us a competitive advantage over other nations. When some people say to me, you're going to be, you probably are secretly hoping that China will take over the world. And I think to myself, no, I'm not hoping that at all. If China took over the world, it would mean every choice my family's made for 3 generations turns out to be wrong, right? I've bet on the United States. And so if I were to go back to where I came from, that would be Detroit, right? So there's both the idealistic argument from civil rights and then just the self-interested argument that if you were to look at what is actually in the US national interest. So for example, if you look at Nobel Prizes won by people who are US citizens and you counted up how many of those were new US citizens or the descendants of people who had come just a generation earlier, if not a majority, it would be a plurality, are people who are newcomers.
Yeah. And adding on to that, the majority of Asians today are first generation immigrants or refugees. And then if you add to that, the children of immigrants or refugees, that is a large proportion of our community. How does the birthright citizenship issue impact current immigration patterns, given that the majority of immigrants are coming from Latin America or coming from Asia today in a very different way than in 1898, when there were immigration restrictions, as you say, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act and other exclusion acts or agreements that would follow. How does this differ now when the majority of them are coming from Latin America and Asia? And how do we think about the controversies regarding birthright citizenship?
Well, partly this is a test for Asian Americans too, right? It's a moral dilemma. Will Asian Americans try to distance themselves and say, we're the ones who waited in line? And I hear this from some Asian Americans. They say, we're legal immigrants. We're not like those bad people. And what they don't realize is, first of all, there are lots of Asians who are undocumented too, right? We tend to racialize these categories, even though they shouldn't be. The wait staff, the all-you-can-eat seafood buffet, folks who are rideshare drivers, and then there are people who have overstayed their visa, right? They too are technically illegal. They didn't enter illegally. They came legally, but now they're out of status would be the nicer way to put it. But aside from that, there are many Asian Americans or they're not technically Americans, many Asians in America who are undocumented. Second, the rules are not actually, despite the 1965 changes, neutral and fair. The waiting list and the amount of time you have to wait to get a visa varies so significantly by nation. So 1965 was profound, right? That that piece of legislation is what really wiped away the explicit, overt, racist measures from the 1917 period on. And when I say overt racist, I try to use the term racist sparingly. You just go back and read what was written then, and the people who said we need to restrict migration, they were avowedly, openly white supremacists, and in a way that would shock people. They even distinguished among white ethnic groups, and if you were Southern European or Eastern European, which correlated to Catholic or Jewish, they didn't count you as white. And for some, if you were Swedish, you didn't count as white, right? They had a very constricted conception of who counted as white and who was good. So I think this is a test of, do we really mean birthright citizenship in its universal, ideal, pure form, that if you're born on US soil, you are a citizen, right? The exception is if you're a diplomat's child. And we see this arise again and again, the false, baseless birther rumors that President Barack Obama was somehow not a US citizen, that sort of thing. It's used to attack people who are seen as indelibly foreign. And that's how Asians often were seen. And people, now that there's a reluctance to be openly racial or racist, people want to say, no, this isn't about race. This is actually just citizens and aliens. And that's a legitimate line to draw. And they want to say the reason that's a legitimate line to draw is, well, every nation distinguishes between citizens and aliens. And that is true, right? To vote, for example, there are some areas where a pure line, citizens get to do something, aliens don't get to do it. We accept that, right? But part of our acceptance of that is based on the notion that the rules about who gets to be a citizen are fair, right? That people have an opportunity. And this is why programs such as the Dreamers program are so important, because there's a sense that, there's something wrong if you arrived as an infant, right? You're not making any decisions and you entered the nation illegally, but you've known no other nation, you're English speaking, you have no meaningful ties to wherever it is your parents came from, and you're contributing, and you're no different than the person sitting next to you in high school, but for something that happened when you were 2 years old that you have no control over. How does it help the US? How does it help the world if we take that person, tear them away from everything they've known, and send them back someplace that they don't know? And that's not a rhetorical question. I would defy people to explain what benefit that actually creates in the world that we could look at and say, well, that was worth the cost of inflicting trauma on that human being and that family and that.
And so do you think, the attention to birthright citizenship today, given the large population of Asian immigrants that are here in comparison to the historical period, and because of 1965 and because of 1975 at the end of the Vietnam War as well, when refugees came in large numbers, do you think any of this attention to trying to get rid of birthright citizenship is connected to anti-Asian animosity or anti-Asian violence in any ways? Is there a connection between the two then?
I would say absolutely. I would say sometimes it's explicit and in your face. We just witnessed something during the pandemic, and it's subsiding, and we're already forgetting. but the horrible, vicious violence, which started with people shouting, "Go back to where you came from," right? And escalating from there, spitting on someone, shoving them to the ground, kicking them in the head so many times that they're in a coma, kicking them down or shoving them downstairs or shoving them in front of a subway train to their death, stabbing them, shooting them. And all the while, it starts with, "Go back to where you came from. Your people made us sick. This disease is your fault," right? That's racialized. That's about color of skin, texture of hair, the shape of eyes. And when it first started happening, people would say to me, "Well, isn't this just random violence?" Now, I want to be careful as a lawyer. Do I know beyond a reasonable doubt that in this specific instance, it was a hate crime? Can I prove it? No, I can't. But you look at all these videos, you realize there's something going on here, right? This is not isolated. It's not random. You know, there's one terrible video. There was one of these horrible, brutal beatings. It was I think a 65-year-old female. She was a Filipino background. She was headed to church in Midtown Manhattan, walking down the street. Some guy shoves her around, starts kicking her in the head. And it's horrible. It's horrific. I don't encourage you to watch this video. You can find it easily if you want to watch it for yourself. As shocking as that is, at the end of the video, it's even worse. The last 2 or 3 seconds, you see two big burly guys who are the doormen for the building. They've been watching the whole thing. They didn't intervene. Not only that, they go over and they literally close the door on the victim who's lying there on the sidewalk. They don't go help her. They close the door on her. That callousness, that indifference to suffering, and Asian Americans were greatly overrepresented among healthcare workers at the front line, risking their own lives, even when someone afflicted with COVID said, "I don't want to be treated by this person because they're Asian." And, you know, I don't think it matters whether we get into, was this from Wuhan? Was it a lab? Because someone who is born in the US, you know, what do I have to do with Wuhan and a lab? Nothing, right? And it wasn't just people of Chinese descent. And it wouldn't be right to find some random person from China and beat them up. That would be wrong too. I want to be clear about that. But it was people who were US born, right? So that's mistaken identity. And sometimes they'd be Burmese, Korean, Vietnamese, right? There were even people who were Latino who looked Asian, who got attacked by people shouting, "This disease is your fault." They're not even Asian. They just have Asian looking features. You know, it's the "you all look alike" theme. And they were viciously beaten. So partly when we saw that, it made me think, how many cases do you have to see before you recognize, geez, there's something going on here? And finally, the Atlanta spa shooting happened. And then people realized, okay, now we get that this is not random. This is a racial phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you reminded us of what we've been going through the last few years during COVID. Has been a consistent part of our history, a continuity of the history of animosity that you referred to earlier against Asian Americans in the 1800s and then also in the 1900s. I think it's a larger issue of birthright citizenship, of establishing Asians as American in this country. Let me move to some of the questions that I've been getting. So continue to send your questions and I'll go through some of them. So I'm going to read, these are the audience questions. And one of them asked about, is the birthright citizenship and Wong Kim Ark case taught in higher education or in education as a whole? When you go around and give this talks, are you surprised what people know or don't know about this case?
I'm not surprised by most things. This is not taught. Even people of Asian descent don't generally know about Wong Kim Ark. You know, people don't know about the internment of Japanese Americans, which is the other huge example that were actions taken under the color of law, supported by just about everyone, by both major parties, that said, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how assimilated you are. That's the other aspect of this. Sometimes people are tempted to say, well, if you just tried to fit in, right? But that's not what these cases are about. No one ever asks how much Wong Kim Ark tried to fit in. And as you pointed out about the military service, so many of the Chinese immigrants and other Asian immigrants, as in the Civil War, and the slide that I showed to open up, served in the U.S. military. They risked life and limb. How much more patriotic, how much more dedicated could you be than as a non-citizen to say, I'm going to fight for this nation and I will give my blood and that will prove my loyalty. During World War II, the segregated, and the U.S. Army was racially segregated then. The 442nd and the 100th, the all Japanese American units with white officers, were the most highly decorated U.S. military units in history. That's how much sacrifice was involved. These issues are alive, and partly why I think it's important for us to do this work is because when you go back and read and you learn about this, you realize, wow, people were not imagining this violence, this discrimination. This is real. And there's a lot of controversy right now and a lot of debate about how we talk about these issues. And what I always try to do is ground everything I say, not my opinion, not my say-so. This is why I want to quote the Constitution, quote the Solicitor General's briefs, why I encourage people, go and look up Gomper's Meat versus Right pamphlet. You can find it online, you can read it for yourself, you can see it. I want people to actually look at the evidence for themselves. And partly, there is an optimistic aspect to the story, which is Wong Kim Ark won, right? You might have gone into this thinking, well, he's going to lose. They hate people of Chinese descent because those very same justices had written all these horrible opinions in the same time period about people like Wong Kim Ark's parents. But this shows that they respected the rule of law and they realized, okay, we've got the 14th Amendment in front of us and it says persons born. And then it explains their citizens. And so they followed the law, even though, see, I think it's more compelling if we think, wait a minute, these justices were probably pretty deeply prejudiced. They were not going to invite Wong Kim Ark over for dinner. They would accept him as a waiter. They might accept him as a chef, but they weren't going to seat him at the table and drink brandy and smoke cigars with him. Yet they would rule in his favor, which shows that at the end of the day, they looked at the law and they realized, okay, he has the law on his side. We have to rule in his favor. And that gives me a little bit of hope.
But I think it goes back to you arguing that, this is such an important case, but unfortunately, even the students in my classes who come to college, and the majority have gone through the educational system, even in California, they're not familiar with this case at all. Perhaps if they go to law school, it's being taught in law school, as I understand it, much more today than higher ed or the K through 12. But I think it's one of the most important cases, as you say, Supreme Court cases, because we won. There were so many other cases where Asian Americans went to the courts, but they lost, challenging citizenship, et cetera. So this is such an important case that I think still needs a lot of effort in terms of incorporating into the educational system. I have another question someone would want to ask you. It's about the reaction at the time. What was the reaction to this decision at the time that it was made. And this is an anonymous, someone asked this question anonymously. Was there a reaction to this decision because it impacted Chinese and other Asian Americans here, allowing them to have the rights of citizenship, but also in his case, allowing them to travel and then return to the US, which is what Wong Kim Ark had a problem. They wouldn't allow him to come to the US, return to the US, even though he was a US citizen.
You know, that's a great question. And I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure. If anyone on this Zoom is a doctoral student or a student of any type who's interested, there's a lot of this history that has not yet been written. And I don't quite know exactly what the reaction to the Wong Kim Ark case is, but I will offer two additional facts that might help us think about this. Bear in mind that at the time, if you look just at Chinese, the gender ratio, it depends on what exact decade you look at, but the gender ratio was something like 9-to-1 or more. So it was almost all men, and you know, in some places it was even more than that. It was more than an order of magnitude. You know, it could be something like 50-to-1. All right, so you're not going to have that much reproduction, right? So that's the first fact. The second fact is this is in the era of anti-miscegenation laws, right? So, well, of course, people have children out of wedlock. They always have. It would have been comparatively rare compared to today to have mixed marriages because it was illegal in about a third of the US, not everywhere. And what's interesting is those laws were not enforced uniformly. They were mostly enforced if it was white and a person of color. If people of color married one another, so Afro-Asian couples, etc., the enforcement was not strict. And there was a gendered aspect, right? If it was a white male and an Asian female, that was very different than an Asian male and a white female, because if it was an Asian immigrant male and a white American female, let me say that again, Asian immigrant male who couldn't naturalize and a white US citizen female, what would happen is the wife would lose her citizenship. Under the law at that time, she would be stripped of her US citizenship. So I'm just speculating here, but I wouldn't think that, at least as to Chinese Americans, that people were thinking there are going to be a lot of birthright citizens, because you've got the exclusion, you've got these gender ratios, and you have anti-miscegenation laws. It's just highly unlikely that you're going to have very many. You will have more than zero, but you're not going to have significant numbers, even someplace like San Francisco, of people who aren't native born. Now, that's not true for people of Japanese descent, because Japanese migration was very different. And in part, Japanese Americans looked at the Chinese example. So that the heyday of Japanese coming to the US occurred a little later. And so there was the whole picture bride phenomena, and there was an effort for the Japanese to establish families because they were worried about the image of opium dens and, you know, the heathen Chinese. They wanted to show that the Japanese were families. One last piece to that, though, that shows the futility of this, right? It doesn't matter how much you show, you know, families speak English, Christian, etc. It doesn't work. Because the native sons of the Golden West, which you might guess from their name, native sons of the Golden West, they were an expressly nativist group. I mean, just openly, avowedly, the reason they existed was to keep people out. But they were also dishonest. They weren't native sons, period, because when the tiny number, so I said it was a number greater than zero, of Chinese Americans, that is native born, thus had birthright citizenship, showed up and said to the native sons, "We too are native sons, let us in." They said, no, you're not native sons. That's not what we mean. So they wouldn't let in native born Chinese Americans, who then formed a group called the Native Sons of the Golden State. which later became the Chinese American Citizens Alliance, which continues to exist to this day, as does the Native Sons of the Golden West. Then during World War II, the Native Sons of the Golden West sued. They lost, but they sued in San Francisco, and they said all Japanese Americans, remember, Japanese immigrants couldn't naturalize, so Japanese Americans meant born in the U.S. The tiny number who had served the U.S. in World War I, was called then the Great War. The Native Sons sued, and they said strip them from the voter rolls. This was in San Francisco. They said they should not be eligible to vote, even though they're citizens. They lost that case. But this just shows that even people who say all we're doing is we're against the aliens, that's not true. They're only against some foreigners, not all foreigners.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, you're so right that this issue of birthright citizenship had a big impact on the Japanese American community, because more women were able to immigrate. And to the point, but by World War II, during the period of incarceration, the majority of the Japanese American population who were incarcerated was U.S. citizens with their immigrant parents. And so it had a huge impact on the Japanese American community to have children who were citizens. But going back to the context, I would say the numbers were much smaller at the time the decision was made. And I don't know if we have social media. They didn't have social media in the ways that these decisions like this were known to the rest of the country or the population. So let me ask you a question from Janlin, who is asking about the internal diversity. I'm going to expand on the question a little bit on the internal diversity of the Chinese American or Asian American population. So you have 5, 6 generation Chinese Americans, who have been here for 6 generations or 7 generations, and then you have new immigrants who are coming here, their first generation. You have incredible diversity within the population, and so there's a division, political ideologies. There are some Asian Americans and Chinese Americans who are not open to more immigrants coming in, who are not supportive of immigration reform, and who would be questioning birthright citizenship issues, et cetera. Can you discuss this internal diversity and the reactions to immigration policies, et cetera?
Sure. I'll give you 2 different responses. Yes, as to diversity, it's amazing. There are Latin American Asians, right, whose great-grandparents went to Peru or Venezuela or Brazil, and then their parents came here. So they speak Spanish, they speak Portuguese, right? And there are so many differences, whether you're from mainland China or Taiwan or Hong Kong and so on, what dialect, what faith, and absolutely so much diversity. And that's not even taking into account, which we always should, people of mixed background, people who are transracially adopted, right? Who still face some of the same issues of violence, because when they're walking down the street, no one says, "Oh, I'm not going to spit on you because you're transracially adopted." Like, it just is, you can't just flash your passport and people will leave you be. Mm-hmm. So yes, as to diversity, but yes, also as to the political differences. There are studies now that show really fascinating movements, and it depends on generation, depends on ethnicity. Some of it depends on what part of the nation, on some of the hot button issues where you have both very progressive Asian Americans and very conservative ones. So there was a letter written about 3 or 4 years ago, an open letter from Asian American children to their immigrant parents about Black Lives Matter, mm-hmm. and why they support Black Lives Matter. It created quite a stir. And there was a Chinese American student at Yale who wrote something to the first generation, which prompted a rebuttal by someone of the first generation, who basically was saying, you're just such an ingrate, you're so American and you're an ingrate. But I think you're absolutely right. There is just a a tremendous amount of difference. I'll close with this thought. You know, one of the things I've been trying to do for my whole career, but especially the past few years, is to say to some of our friends who are progressive, who care about civil rights, yet, and it pains me so much that some of our friends who do civil rights work also have the model minority image or the natural foreigner image of Asian Americans. Their view is Asian Americans, you know, you're privileged, you're white adjacent, you don't need anything, you know, you don't have any concerns, and they're sort of dismissive. And one of the things that I try to say to them is, okay, first of all, it's wrong that the image that you have, not every Asian American is a crazy rich Asian, right? And not every Asian American is fresh off the boat, right? Which used to be a pejorative phrase, but now with the hit TV show, fresh off the boat is something we can embrace. And if you look at it, Asian Americans as a group show more income disparity internally than any other demographic, including other people of color. Why? Because it's what social scientists call bimodal, right? There are two flows coming in. One is wealthy, right? They either have money or they have human capital. They have a PhD, they have an MD. But another stream is the rideshare drivers, right? It's people who dropped out of high school. It's people who don't have the same advantages, but are perceived as having those same advantages. So we all know maybe some colleagues, maybe some allies, maybe even some friends who aren't Asian American. And when you raise the concerns of Asian Americans, even though they're civil rights advocates, they're skeptical or they might even scoff at it. Well, one of the other things I say to them is, you've got to reach out to Asian Americans, because if you don't, here's what's going to happen. The people who are hostile to diversity, equity, inclusion will court Asian Americans, and you're going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're going to generate a phenomena of Asian Americans who are opposed to civil rights if you don't include them. So as a matter of principle and pragmatism, you've got to bring Asian Americans in. And I always try to explain Asian Americans will help, not harm, the historic struggle for Black equality. That's a subject for a different day. But so many people like Grace Lee Boggs, Yuri Kochiyama, Asian Americans who were there in the 50s and 60s and marched. And that's a story too that just hasn't been told, and most people don't know it unless they themselves lived it. But that's why it's so important to have this program. So I want to say again to everyone, thank you. It's really been an honor to be here with you virtually and to talk about Wong Kim Ark.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I appreciate that. At this point, thank you so much for this conversation. And I think it gives us a greater understanding of the historic 125-year anniversary of this important case and what it means for future generations as well. And given that it is now an issue of public debate, we're now revisiting this issue as well. So your research and your writings have been particularly helpful academically and in the general public for an understanding of this particular case. So let me invite Michael Trung back in.
Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Linda, for this really great discussion. And it is really important now more than ever to really delve into this topic, especially how historic legislation continues to impact our community today. Before we wrap up, Frank and Linda, do you have anything you'd like to leave the audience with some closing thoughts?
It was just great to be here, and I hope that we all learn this history and pass it on. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And I want to thank the audience and the audience questions as well. Thank you. I learned a lot today as well. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And I just want to give some brief announcements. On April 20th, we'll be hosting our special edition of Kids Storytime. You can follow the link in the chat box. And also in May, Cal is celebrating the Asian American and Pacific Island Heritage Month. Feel free to follow us on social media so you can sign up a newsletter and receive the latest program information. Lastly, if you haven't stopped by the museum lately, be sure to stop by and check out our newest exhibition, The Boba Show. We're open Tuesdays to Sunday from 10 to 3 in downtown Los Angeles. Thank you again for joining us and have a great night.